Welcome to 12.3 Agriculture. So today we're going to start talking about the history of agriculture. So last class we went into what are the best farming practices to prevent erosion of our topsoil and to be more efficient with water. So how did all this agriculture come to be? Humans have been practicing agriculture for about 10,000 years. So prior to agriculture, people were hunter-gatherers throughout most of our history. And so 10,000 years ago, we transitioned from following herds of animals and hunting them and gathering berries off of bushes to planting our own seeds in one set place. And when that happened, it really changed a lot about human culture. So when we look at the history of agriculture, we see where a lot of these crops began in this map here. And then from there, obviously, they have spread out to other places, and we plant them in all different parts of the world. What we did is we did some selective breeding. So selective breeding is when you pick the best traits that you desire out of the organisms, and you breed for those traits, leaving the unwanted traits behind. So in early agriculture, people began planting seeds from the plants they liked the most, the foods that were the most desirable or could feed their population the best. This indeed was already selective breeding in that we were selecting the seeds to propagate. This crop cultivation allowed humans to settle permanently in places, typically near water sources, because you have to have food and water to survive. And at that point, instead of chasing down wildlife constantly, they started to raise their own. So they started to raise and domesticate livestock. So they had a steady breeding supply. And this provided humans with a steady supply of food that they did not have before. And then through this is how civilization came to be. So when we look at crops before selective breeding versus after, this is the precursor to watermelons. This is wild watermelons. This is wild corn, which was like a grass, a grain grass, and then we obviously picked the ones with the biggest kernels, and over time bred and bred until we got corn to what it is today. This is a wild banana. You can still find these out in nature. A wild eggplant, which looks nothing like the purple eggplant we're used to. A wild carrot, and cabbage, kale, and broccoli, and a bunch of others all came from this little flowering plant right here looking at the leaves. So by over the years cultivating these plants, we can get to what they are today. And so this is exactly how it happens. So here we have some really skinny corn, and out of all the corn, the seeds we choose to plant are going to be the corn plant that produces the biggest kernels. Then out of their babies, we select only the biggest, and then we select the biggest again. And over time, the plant gets larger and larger. And this is done without any genetic manipulation, because we didn't have this technology back then, but just selecting which one we're going to plant or breed. So with traditional agriculture, this agriculture was powered by people and animals and not by large machineries. So obviously a little bit more environmentally friendly in that area because you're not reliant on fossil fuels, but it is a very, very hard job to do. And we still have some populations of individuals that farm this way, especially in third world countries, and even here in the United States, like the Quakers and the Amish. So this was the kind of agriculture you typically saw all the way through the Industrial Revolution when we started to use machines powered by fossil fuels to do farming. And this powered the Industrial Agricultural Revolution. So agriculture that requires the use of fossil fuels is this large-scale farming. All right, so this is different than the type of farming we were talking about previously where we avoid monocultures and we try to make our farming practices more environmentally friendly. This kind of farming is not at all environmentally friendly, but it can feed a large growing population, which is what we have. So we do right now rely very much on this kind of farming. And so the equipment and the debt that the farmers go into to be able to do this is massive on huge scales. So it's all mechanized at this point, and you're doing monocultures, so pests are even more of an issue. So you also have to spray all the food with the pesticides, which means you have to purchase the pesticides, and you look for ones that chemically are going to work for the crop that you have to do this large scale type of thing. And this also requires a lot of irrigation as well, because these farms are not designed to capture water. So they're efficient, but they're not necessarily the best way. But they do feed a huge population, which again is what we have. So it's hard to say, hey, stop farming this way when you need the food supply. So the green evolution is when we start using these new technologies and new crop varieties and new farming practices in the mid to late 1900s. And the benefit of this, just like I said previously, is huge crop yields that kept people from starving, especially in third world countries or developing countries. So if you look at this graph down here, this is the amount of food produced per acre, all right, in the different countries in the 1960s. So the USA was still ahead of its time in farming practices in some of these other countries. But look at it in the 2007, and the technologies we use right now are significantly better, and they have to be to feed the population, or most of us would be starving. So you have to use these technologies. It's just maybe we can find a happy medium where we're not totally reliant on them. The other good thing about these benefits of these is you can grow more food in the same amount of land, which is what we see in the graphic here. And so by doing that, it means we don't need to keep cutting down forests. Unfortunately, it's still happening, but we don't need to do that if we use these technologies. The cost, the amount of energy we use, which means the amount of fossil fuels being burned. So a 7,000% increase in the energy used by agriculture. And then, of course, with these monocultures, large-scale farming practices, you have a lot of erosion, salinization of the soil, which ruins the soil, which now makes you reliant on fertilizers, desertification, eutrophication of water, which is when you put all the nutrients in the water from the fertilizers running off, and the water grows algae and then kills everything in it, and then just general pollution. So there's a lot of downsides to this, but you are feeding your population. So there's, like, again, back to two sides of the coin. So with this pest and weed control, in North America, insects eat about 13% of all our crops. Well, that's money down the drain and people who aren't getting a meal. In tropical areas, the crops are significantly worse because there's insects are there in larger numbers, and they grow and reproduce way more quickly in warm climates. So worldwide, pests destroy about 33% of the world's potential food harvest. This is just something that happens as part of the natural ecosystem. So you either have to accept it or you fight it. So wild plants naturally have protection from these pests. They make their own. And when they grow throughout the landscape, they're also not grouped together in a monoculture like these large-scale farms. And so the plants have a harder time finding all the plants. They have to look for them, which slows them down, and sometimes they don't find them and feed just on that plant. And so those plants can actually produce more fruit and more flowers and more leaves than a crop that's a monoculture in a large field. So looking at this, scientists figured out, hey, these monocultures might not be the best way to go. So some of the ways that we currently deal with the pests and weeds on our farms is, well, chemical pesticides is the #1 way most large-scale farms deal with them. They spray the pesticides. They're effective. They're relatively cheap, though you have to buy them constantly, and that can start adding up. And the other part is that their pests will evolve to be resistant to them. That's kind of how it happens, just like antibiotic resistance. So when they evolve to be resistant, you've got to use nastier chemicals the next round to try to fight these pests. And this is not a good thing. This is a really bad idea. So the other thing we can use is biological pest control. So this is more of a permanent solution where we are going to use living organisms to fight living organisms, ideally native ones. But this could also sometimes harm non-target organisms, can be prey to them as well. So down here in the picture, it says the cactus moth larvae are used to control the prickly pear cactus, but it also threatens many rare native cacti when you have a very large population of them. Then there's integrated pest management. This is becoming more popular, that combines the two methods, so you're not totally reliant on one or the other, and it reduces the amount of chemicals that we need to use, but still tries to maintain it at a level that it's not going to impact the environment outside of there. And so a lot of farms are looking at using a combination of the two. Now, pesticides, what are they exactly? Well, they're chemicals used to kill insects, weeds, and other crop pests. They can harm good plants and insects too, and even wildlife, and they're very, very bad for people. So when they spray these pesticides, you don't want to be anywhere near there. And it can lead to things, health issues like lung issues and cancer and chemical burns. So agricultural pesticides that you see being laid down onto your fields are not the same thing as the pesticides you would use in your house. They're much more concentrated, way, way, way stronger. They're intended solely for outdoor use. Do not ever use them in your home if you can get your hands on them. Many of them are restricted for certain kinds of applicators, like you have to put them in the planes here, the crop dusters, so that only certified people are handling them because they are so dangerous. They are toxic in a residential setting and illegal for people to use. We've had lots of health issues, like I said, associated with pesticides. It's a very large concern for a lot of people, especially if you live near large-scale farms that are using them regularly. So millions of dollars in cleanup because of contaminated homes and businesses from some of these chemicals that they put out. And where they use large amounts of this, it can cause much, much higher cancer rates, especially in children, way higher than the national average if you live near these farms. And it can also damage your nervous system. And this is a picture of some of the chemical burns that could occur. So they're not something to mess around with, really. Some pesticides are what's called persistent. That means they stay around in the environment. They don't break down over time. And so these persistent ones accumulate in the ecosystem, in the water and the soil. And so one that most people are familiar with is DDT. DDT was a mistake of epic proportions. It was a pesticide that worked really well. They used it on the farms. They even used it in households, as you can see by the ad down here, DDT for control of household pets. This was their slogan, DDT is good for me. They had the dancing fruit and animals. Here's a little container that the DDT came in, and this is a picture of them spraying it onto the fields, and you can see these young people running around in that cloud because they just did not realize how bad this chemical was. And so DDT caused things like cancer, of course, and it did not go away when it was sprayed. They landed up banning it in the United States in the 1970s, and even though they banned it in the 1970s, they can still detect it in the environment today. They've even found it in breast milk. So this has stuck around for a long time. And so we need to be really careful about the choice of chemicals that we are choosing to spray, because if they kill those pests, there's a good chance that they're not healthy for other living organisms as well. The other thing that happened with DDT, because it persisted in the ecosystem, is it found its way up the food chain. So it was in the water, and from the water it got into the zooplankton, from the zooplankton into the fish, and then from the fish into our bald eagle population. And so bald eagles for a very long time were on the endangered species list. And the reason why is one of the things the DDT did is made bald eagle eggs brittle. And so the mama eagle would lay her eggs and then go to sit on her eggs, and they would just crunch. And so the bald eagles literally were incapable of breeding because of the accumulation of DDT in their tissues and what it did to their eggs when they laid them. So we ended up having to bring in bald eagles from nature into captivity, feed them food that we were sure did not have DDT in it, and breed them in captivity, and then after DDT was banned, start a breeding program to reintroduce them in the wild. And so we have successfully done that, and they are now off the endangered list, and they're still threatened because their numbers are low, relatively low, but they are making a comeback purely because of breeding programs in zoological parks and sanctuaries. And so still today, we no longer take the bald eagles out of the wild unless they're injured. If a bird gets injured, it goes into a facility and joins the breeding program where we raise the chicks and reintroduce them into the wild. And this is an expensive program that the zoological parks do, but they do it for the betterment of the species. And this particular species is a symbol of our country, so it has extra importance to it because of that. Not that they're not all important. So another species that's being affected by our pesticides is our pollinators. And we are relying on pollinators. They do a lot of work for us for free, pollinating these plants so that they grow fruits and flowers for us. And so pollination is the process by which pollen comes from one plant to another, which is sexual reproduction. And pollen can be carried on the wind depending on the plant, but many of them use an insect like bees. And so agriculture is totally relying on this, on nature doing its part, but we're spraying these pesticides, which are then killing the pollinators, which is really not the best idea. And so they've declined because of this pesticide use over time. And other issues have compounded with this, other parasites and other things. They have now really reduced the honeybee population to where it's a significant issue. So one of the things we're looking at is saving the bees. You will see things on the internet and sometimes commercials and movies and TV shows about how we need to save the bees because the bees help us to grow food to eat. So it's not just about them, it's also about us, which part of the reason why Filer does the beehives at our school is not just to create a product, but also to help with this problem, to save the bees, keep those populations going, keep them healthy, so that we have them long into the future, because without them, we would have a real problem growing food. So here we are in food production. You can pause your lecture now and pull up your 12.4 notes. So each year, Earth gains 75 million people and loses 5 to 7 million hectares of productive cropland, all right, mostly due to desertification and whether the soil is fertile or not. So this is a problem. More people and less area to grow food is a real problem. So food security in many places in the world is a big issue. Now, we don't experience this quite as much in our country. Usually our food insecurities are related to income, not availability, but that could change if we don't treat our cropland appropriately. So since 1960s, our ability to produce food has grown faster than the human population. That's the only reason why we've been able to keep up with this change is because of the invention of things like GMOs and selective breeding. But we still have 1 billion people that are hungry worldwide that don't have access to food or food that is at a level where they could afford. So malnutrition and undernourishment are very common in developing worlds, third world countries, okay, like Africa here. So scientists are looking at this and they're like, how could we do this better? How could we guarantee that all people have a food supply at all times? And so there's a lot of ways that we could do this. And one of the things they're looking at is not just the supply of food, but the quality of the food as well. So malnutrition is a condition that occurs when people don't consume enough calories or do not get a sufficient variety of foods. And the variety of foods is an issue in more places than just not having access to food as well, where they're not getting the proteins they need. So one of the things scientists have done is looking at genetically modified organisms. They are creating plants that grow proteins within them. So they have potatoes that can survive drought and ones that have proteins in them naturally, so that if they're eating a potato-based diet that's easy to grow in places that are stricken with drought, that they can still get proteins that they wouldn't otherwise have access to because the plants will borrow genes from other organisms to be able to produce those. So people worldwide usually consume the major nutrients, the same major nutrients, and the same basic kind of foods. But our developed countries have a much higher percentage of proteins and fats, and that's because we can afford those things. Protein is more expensive. When you guys start doing your grocery shopping, you will notice the cost of meat versus the cost of something like pasta or rice. So less developed countries are eating mostly carbohydrates. So if you look down here worldwide, so the orange is carbohydrates, everybody's eating about the same amount of carbohydrates here in the world, right? But then if you look at the fats and proteins, there's a big difference there. So here is North America, and we have the highest amount of these products, especially the fats. We have a lot of fatty food that is manufactured for us to make us want it. And then our proteins. And then if you look at the developing countries versus developed, that's where the big difference is in these foods, all right? And sometimes this is by choice, and sometimes this is by what is available. So our food is not for sure distributed equally. It's all about where the money is and who can grow the food. So if you look at food consumption in calories daily, in the northern hemisphere over here, North America, and up into Asia, Russia, and then Australia consumes the most, all right, over 3,000 calories daily per person. When you go into Africa, where there's a lot of food shortages, then you can get less than 2,000, and that's when you can lead to being malnourished and or starving. So genetically modified organisms that are controversial, but these organisms have really kind of saved the day as far as food supply and will hopefully continue to do so in the future. So these are any organisms that have had their DNA changed, all right, in a laboratory. Commonly engineered traits include rapid growth, so the plants grow faster and produce the same amount of food in less time, so you can grow more crops. Naturally pest resistant in that the plant produces its own chemicals to fight pests instead of having to spray pesticides, which is better but does need to be closely regulated. And then frost tolerant as well, where the ice is not going to kill this stuff off. In the United States, about 85 to 90% of our corn is genetically modified. You guys have been eating it your entire life. 90% of our soybean, cotton, and canola oil crops come from genetically modified strains. So we've all been eating these. If you go to Walmart and you buy any fruits or vegetables, odds are they are all genetically modified. So in the United States, we've been eating these for a long time. Everybody eats them every day. But many of these products have not been fully tested for their environmental impacts, not their safety to us. They go through a process where they're tested through the Food and Drug Administration to make sure they're safe for human consumption before they go on the market. But what the impact would be on the environment as they grow as far as transfer of genes and interbreeding between non-GMO plants and GMOs is where the concern is. So sometimes scientists are warning about this and what this could do in the future. And so this graph just shows the rate at which we are producing these genetically modified plants is just increasing over time. It's not going anywhere. So two sides of every coin, the risks are we could potentially create what's called super pests. So when all these plants are pest resistant naturally, the pests will always evolve to fight that, and you could make super pests that are harder to kill off. But the same thing could occur by using pesticides. And then the bigger risk is this contamination of non-GM plants, which we would lose then some of our biodiversity, and we could probably cause some really, really significant food issues for ourselves if that occurs. The benefits, of course, insect-resistant crops without the need for insecticides and pesticides, herbicide-resistant crops, which will also encourage tillage conservation and make our soil more fertile. So all of these things are really great, including just being able to feed our population. So industrial food production are feedlots that we talked about when we were talking about rangeland a little bit. These are an alternative to open grazing in which energy-rich food is delivered in a concentrated group of livestock or poultry. So very little land to create a lot of food, which, we do need to use less land, but there's benefits and there's costs. So benefits, less soil degradation because they are contained to a small area. You're not using fertilizer on these guys because they're just on dirt, basically standing in their own feces. But the cost is because they're standing in their own feces and they're packed super tightly, disease can spread really readily between the population. So they're feeding these guys antibiotics in their food every day. And what that lands up causing is antibiotic resistance in both them and in us, which is really problematic. There's a lot of water contamination from these feedlots because there's runoff, there's no plants there, so when it rains it picks up all the fecal matter, any leftover food, and that goes right into the water source. And then of course, just how the animals are cared for. These animals are not going to be cared for the same way animals on a small farm that are grazing are going to be cared for. So there's a lot of stress to the animal. It's a really poor quality of life for them, and so a lot of people feel very strongly that this is not the way to raise animals, even as a food product. We also have industrial food production and aquaculture with how we grow fish now. So not all fish are going out into the ocean and fishing for fish to collect them. We farm fish. And so when we farm fish, they have like these little temporary type ponds that they set up, and they put the little baby fry fish in there, and then they grow them to a size until they can be removed. And it's very efficient for catching them. It can be sustainable if you do it in a certain way, if you follow certain guidelines. It can reduce bycatch significantly. Bycatch is when you're trolling with a net out in the ocean that you catch animals that you don't mean to catch, like dolphins or sea turtles or sharks. And so it's a big difference for that, and a lot less fossil fuels because you don't have to take a big boat out into the ocean to catch your fish. You're already there in your little pond areas where you're raising these guys, and you don't need to use all that fossil fuel. But the cost is because the fish are all clumped together in these ponds, and they typically are all the same kind of fish, so similar to monocultures, right? That with disease gets in there, it can wipe out the whole population and spread rapidly. It produces a lot of waste, so the water can get really, really dirty, and then that can then cause pollution. And then also we could have all these farm-raised animals, much like the GMO crops, that get out into the wild population, and they can either outcompete the wild population or breed with them and reduce some of our diversity. So what we're hoping to do is be more sustainable in all of our agricultural pursuits. So the idea to do this is let's not deplete our soil faster than it forms. That's a real bad idea. Do not reduce the amount or quality of our soil. So find ways to keep our soil fertile. Make sure we're using our water appropriately. Maintain our genetic diversity, which is a big challenge. And all of that is important to be able to keep long-term crop and livestock production where we can feed this growing population. Organic agriculture is sustainable, so that's something we can do, but there are challenges that as well because it does not produce as much food as those large factory farms. All right, so but it doesn't use those chemicals. And then support your local small-scale agriculture. Go to the farmers markets, buy organic when you can afford to buy organic, because sometimes it is more expensive. But when you can, even if it's just one product, support that, because that is better for you and better for your ecosystem. Bye, guys.